Only a tree or bush could hide an enemy ready to annihilate them. Ambushes were the order of the day, and they always ended in a shower of blood for both sides. In this new installment of military history, we're going to reconstruct in great detail 3 important offensives carried out by the Viet Cong. A series of surprise attacks in which the powerful United States Army was totally humiliated by local guerrillas. Put on your bulletproof vest, grab your M16, and let's get started. Although the official activities of the United States Army in Vietnam began a few years later, a Special Operations Commando Group was established in the Southeast Asian nation in 1964. This was the MACV-SOG, a unit composed of elements of the Navy SEALs, Marines, and members of Special Forces. During its 8 years of activity between 1964 and 1972, MACV-SOG carried out high-risk missions that, despite their importance, were not reported to the general public. In order to operate and keep its structure secret, the group was divided into 3 geographically delimited subcommands: the Northern Command and Control, or CCN, the Central Command and Control, or CCC, and the namesake Southern Command, also called CCS. It was at one of the most important bases in the northern section that the Viet Cong carried out one of the most brutal attacks on the Western invader, in a day that will remain forever in the memories of those who survived. Next, we will listen to the memoirs of John Stryker Meyer, one of the most recognized veterans of the legendary MACV-SOG.
During that attack, it came after midnight. It was a moonless night, and the sappers, who were highly trained NBA soldiers, hit the base.
FOB-4, or Forward Operations Base, was a top-secret operational headquarters of enormous importance to Washington. Its role was fundamental for the organization of missions in one of the most conflictive areas of Vietnam, which is why Green Berets and other top-level commandos who cooperated with MACV-SOG were often housed there. The problem was that the flow of activities was very high, and the base was not always guarded with the same solidity. There were brief windows in which FOB-4 was susceptible to a massive attack, and the Vietnamese knew it. For this offensive, the Communist Front employed the infamous sappers, its special forces soldiers trained to give their lives no matter the conditions. During the war, their reputation was cemented through brutal sacrifices. The sappers were fanatical communists willing to do anything, recapturing the fighting spirit of the old kamikazes of Imperial Japan. Such was their determination for their land that they wore a white bandana on their forehead with the words, "We came here to die," written in blood. On the morning of August 23, 1968, a Viet Cong battalion made up of sappers and regular soldiers entered FOB-4. Their strategy had been considered down to the last detail, so much so that the offensive coincided with the night when the new lunar cycle began. This ensured total darkness for them to move like hunters throughout the Vietnamese jungle. News of the attack spread little by little, as shots and explosions echoed in every corner of the territory. Let's listen to veteran Gene Pugh tell what it was like to cross the camp in the middle of a hail of enemy gunfire.
And I hear is bang, bang. Got you, son of a bitch. And then the next breath, I'm hit, I'm hit, I'm hit. So I go out and start dragging him into the barracks, and I could feel the bullets going by my bare torso and snapping right next to my ear. It's an experience that You just wish that they could hit you instead of feeling it that way.
The Spike Team Rattler reconnaissance team was stationed at the top of the Marble Mountains, one of the highest places in Da Nang. The Viet Cong commandos were enjoying a peaceful night when suddenly a series of rumblings turned the moment into a nightmare. Below, several meters from their positions, the Viet Cong battalion had penetrated the scarce defenses, starting a real massacre. Within minutes, FOB-4 was transformed into a bonfire filled with U.S. corpses. Only a few structures survived the offensive. While the members of the aforementioned Spike Team Rattler reconnaissance team observed all the horror from above, a part of the Vietnamese squad was preparing to ambush them. The sappers used ropes to climb in a few minutes, taking their victims completely by surprise. By the time the climbing team managed to surround Spike Team Rattler, the situation at the entire FOB-4 base had become a true hell on earth. There were tents on fire, lifeless bodies on the ground, and blood mixed with mud and vegetation. In this chaos, North Vietnamese troops ran carrying assault rifles. In one of the most shocking situations, a group of sappers with explosives attached to their bodies ran into the base's ammunition depot. Within seconds, an explosion ended their lives in the weapons reserve of FOB-4.
Get the machine guns up here! It's coming from the house! Pull up, boy! Get up there!
Imagine seeing with your own eyes how a completely deranged enemy soldier runs towards an explosives depot, sacrificing his life to leave you without weapons. This type of kamikaze attack ended up becoming something characteristic during North Vietnamese ambushes. The sappers entered with dynamite or bombs on their bodies to destroy U.S. bunkers and strategic positions. As the first rays of the sun illuminated the base, the Viet Cong troops retreated, leaving only devastation behind. Among the ruins of what had been an important American military post, the bodies of 17 Green Berets were found, as well as dozens of wounded, some seriously. Due to the top-secret nature of their work, the eliminated Americans did not have an official funeral service in Southeast Asia. The next ambush we will discuss was not carried out against elite units, but against Marines operating on the banks of the Ong Thon River on the morning of October 17, 1967. During the first months of 1967, the Vietnamese front suffered the loss of thousands of soldiers as a result of the so-called search and destroy missions carried out by the United States Army. But General Tran Van Tra suggested that the communist troops could still achieve victory if they managed to inflict heavy losses on the Americans. That is why, in mid-1967, the 7th and 9th Divisions of the North Vietnamese Army began to plan what would be one of their most brutal and effective offensives. The Ong Thun River runs through a forested region with lots of vegetation, making it an ideal place to hide. With that in mind, on October 16, 1967, a patrol of soldiers from Alpha Company was sent to survey the region. During their mission, they encountered a small enemy unit, which escaped after a brief firefight. Upon reporting this encounter, Uncle Sam's men received a specific order. They were to find this group of Vietnamese and annihilate them. Part of the plan was for them to advance through occupied territory. Upon finding Viet Cong settlements, they were to contact the artillery batteries waiting a few miles away. The problem was that the local warriors had already noticed the plan and were waiting for the right moment to attack, like a predator watching its prey. One of the American soldiers did not have a good feeling about the operation.
Well, they told us we were going to a place that was going to be pretty rough, and that's all. They didn't tell us what was waiting on us. You had no choice, you just went.
At around 10 a.m. on October 17, 1967, American soldiers encountered Viet Cong troops. As we anticipated, the Asians were waiting in bunkers scattered in strategic areas of the jungle, surrounding the path along which their rival was advancing. When the Americans came within range, chaos broke out. A storm of rifle cartridges, machine guns, and grenades erupted in a deadly ambush. Washington's troops had no time to take up defensive positions and suffered massive losses of personnel during the first minutes of combat. Viet Cong men came from all sides, taking advantage of their bunkers and the geography they knew so well. As the North Vietnamese fire increased, the American soldiers thought they heard the distinctive sound of an M60 machine gun. The men assumed it was cavalry that had come to rescue them, so they ceased fire for fear of hitting one of their own. The Asian front took full advantage of this moment of weakness. At about 11:30 a.m., they sent in reserves of Vietnamese personnel who were waiting for the right moment to act. To make matters worse for the Americans, it was impossible to use artillery, as the proximity of their own to their enemies made it too risky.
Alpha Company disappeared. And now the firing was directed against us, against Delta Company.
Lúc đó thì trung đoàn mới tung cái tiểu đoàn 2 là tiểu đoàn dự bị trong ngày, đánh từ sườn bên phải đánh sang đội hình của địch.
At the same time as this part of the offensive, another group of Asian troops had advanced stealthily to the vicinity of the artillery. When the time came, they pounced on the enemy, further complicating the support that the rest of the Americans ambushed in the Ong Thon region could receive. The members of that artillery battalion remember how chaotic that situation was. On the one hand, they had to coordinate the shots and receive information from the soldiers who were further ahead. On the other, they had to defend themselves from the waves of Vietnamese who tried to take over the position. What better way to listen to North Vietnamese Colonel Vo Minh Triet describing the strategy used by his men?
Cái anh tiểu đoàn cũng có cái đài quan sát của anh, rồi anh trung đoàn có cái đài quan sát của anh, tức là những cái đài leo lên trên cao. Các cái bộ đàm này có trực đầy đủ không mới gọi. Cứ để cho đổ xuống trường, khi kéo vào đến một cái tầm là nổ súng rồi.
One of the artillery observers, that is, those men in charge of surveying the landscape and translating it into concrete data for launching attacks, was Lieutenant Harold Pinky Durham. He was an experienced soldier who was on his second tour in Vietnam. He adopted a dangerous position, exposing himself to hostile fire coming from several directions, but it was necessary so that he could communicate with the rest of the troops and coordinate the artillery attacks. Durham calmly and quietly carried out his work, providing precise coordinates that managed to blow up several Vietnamese positions. Unfortunately, during combat, the brave soldier stepped on a claymore-type mine. which does not explode, but does launch hundreds of metal pieces that pierce the victim's body. Durham suffered very serious injuries, and due to that incident, he was left blind in one of his eyes. With his vision flooded with blood and his body lacerated, the lieutenant continued to operate effectively, providing coordinates by radio even when the bullets grazed his head. Thanks to this man's sacrifice, North Vietnamese forces were unable to complete their massacre as they could no longer advance on the soldiers who had been ambushed further ahead. On that fateful day in October, Durham saved hundreds of lives. Listen to the description of Captain Carl Kaiser, who was part of the engagement and survived to reconstruct the initial events.
And one of the members of the flank security reported hearing movement and hearing a metallic click on his right flank. At that time, a machine gun opened fire on the right file of the 1st Platoon of Alpha Company.
That's the first shots that were heard.
That's correct.
As the American troops managed to organize and regain ground, the Viet Cong soldiers began to retreat. The bulk of the Asian column ceased hostilities and left the area about 2 hours after the hell began. They could return home satisfied, having more than fulfilled their mission, as they managed to inflict brutal damage on the American ranks. In total, Ong Than's offensive claimed the lives of 56 Washington soldiers. Another 75 were wounded, and 2 remain missing to this day. Among the dead was the heroic Harold Durham, who received the legendary Medal of Honor posthumously for his dedication and sacrifice to ensure the survival of his comrades. The Vietnam War was brutal, but it is precisely in these extreme conditions that heroism and military ability flourish. That is why the last ambush that we will review in this video also has a recipient of the legendary Medal of Honor as a participant. Let's put ourselves in time and space. On August 25, 1968, members of the American 48th Transport Group were carrying out their important job, transporting supplies to prevent soldiers from starving to death. On that day, the convoy was particularly large, with a total of 81 trucks that left the town of Long Binh loaded with food, fuel, and weapons. As you can imagine, the roads that connected Vietnam at that time were not exactly gems of modern engineering. Quite the opposite. They were winding and precarious roads that linked the starting point to Saigon, the final destination of the 48th Transport Group. Around noon, the convoy entered the village of Ap Nai, a small rubber tree plantation that stretched along the only passable road. There was a column of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the southern front that allied itself with the United States. Their presence was something to be expected, since these troops collaborated with the pacification of communities like the one they were passing through. Within a few minutes, the convoy already occupied the entire extension of the village. When the first trucks began to leave Ap Nai, the presumed soldiers, friends of Uncle Sam, revealed their true identity. They were Viet Cong men, armed to the teeth to rid the drivers and elements of the 48th Transport Group. Not only did they have surprise on their side, but the Asians had posted snipers on both sides of the road, placing all the American vehicles in the deadly zone, the most vulnerable part in an ambush. Battle of Ap Nhi was not limited to gunfire. The communist soldiers also used machine guns and RPG-7 launchers to destroy the vehicles. The primary objective was to cut off the supply of provisions and, if possible, capture some of the loot to feed the Viet Cong with weapons and food. After spraying the trucks carrying food with bullets, the attackers' fury focused on the fuel tankers, waiting for them to explode and completely block the convoy's advance. In this part of the story, we will meet the great hero who emerged in the midst of this chaos. William Say was a truck driver of only 19 years old. Thanks to his skills behind the wheel, he became a member of the transport company, but that did not mean he did not know how to fight. When the shooting broke out in Ap Nhi, the boy jumped out of his vehicle and looked for the rest of his companions to organize the response. In an ambush, it is essential to stay calm and act by listening to your head, not the fear roaring in your stomach. Say and other drivers positioned themselves 6 meters away from each other, adopting a defensive position to repel the first attack of the Vietnamese soldiers. The boy opened fire and killed 2 enemies who were about 10 meters away. Meanwhile, one of his companions managed to eliminate a Viet Cong soldier, but then his M16 jammed and was unusable. However, the death of the 3 communists scared away a small group of guerrillas who were approaching the trucks. William C. played a prominent role in protecting his comrades at Ap Nhi. First, he fearlessly threw hand grenades that drove the enemy back. The North Vietnamese assumed there were several men, but it was just Say holding his own. During this time, the boy was shot in the wrist and bled out throughout the day. Still, he managed to drag several wounded comrades to safety under a hail of enemy shells. It is hard to imagine the bravery and resolve it takes to repeatedly expose yourself to painful death to save others. It was for this, as well as for eliminating several Viet Cong soldiers, that William received the Medal of Honor. Unfortunately, the 19-year-old ended up dying from multiple wounds that caused massive blood loss. The ambush was incredibly long, with intermittent hostilities that extended over 9 hours of that infamous August 25th. This gave enough time for the U.S. Air Force and artillery to show up, showering the communist guerrillas with fire and destruction. Finally, at 9 p.m., a large infantry unit arrived to assist the rear of the convoy. Seeing themselves outnumbered, the North Vietnamese retreated into the jungle. In total, 30 Americans died, 45 were wounded, and 2 were taken prisoner, making this episode one of the deadliest of the entire conflict. Throughout this installment, it became clear that material or numerical superiority are not always the most powerful cards. Ambushes and surprise attacks can be a deadly tool that balances the scales. The United States learned this the hard way during its intervention in Vietnam. In the heart of the dense eastern jungle, amidst the brutality and chaos of the Vietnam War, a battle took place that would go down in history. This event would be seared into memory as one of the most decisive moments of the conflict. We're talking about the incident at Forward Operating Base 4, better known by its acronym FOB4, and the impressive ambush it suffered at the hands of the Viet Cong. Join us as we explore the events that led to this trap taking place, costing the United States military its most significant single-day casualty. Get ready to delve into a jungle full of dangers and ruthless enemies. Welcome to military history. Before we tell you about the tragedy suffered by American soldiers, we believe you should know about the location where the trap unfolded, as well as the profile of the combatants who faced off in this challenge. We'll briefly develop this information so you can understand the true magnitude of the ambush. During the Vietnam War, an elite group operated under a veil of secrecy. This was the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group, better known as MAC-V-SOG. Forged in the crucible of unconventional warfare, these soldiers were the ghosts that haunted the jungle, executing high-risk missions that defied logic and altered the conditions of the battlefield. Established in 1964, it became the spearhead of U.S. covert operations. Their tasks ranged from strategic reconnaissance in North Vietnam and Laos to the capture of prisoners and the rescue of downed pilots. They even ventured into hostile territory to free prisoners of war in bold liberation exercises. More than mere soldiers, MAC-V-SOG members were survival experts, demolition specialists, masters of stealth, and linguists fluent in the languages of Southeast Asia. Their training was brutal, forging an unbreakable brotherhood among those who dared to defy the impossible. Their actions were as varied as they were lethal. They participated in the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the trigger for U.S. intervention in the war on a large scale. They were present in Operation Steel Tiger, the Tet Offensive, which we'll discuss later, and the Cambodian campaign, leaving an indelible mark on the course of the conflict. Psychological operations were also part of their arsenal, using propaganda and information warfare to undermine enemy morale and sow discord among their ranks. Known for their motto, audacity and professionalism, MAC-V-SOG individuals became legends. Their feats, shrouded in mystery, fueled the public's imagination and generated an aura of invincibility. As the operational site of this spectacular elite force, FOB 4 was a key component in the network of military missions carried out by U.S. Special Forces. Located in central Vietnam, near the border with Laos and Cambodia, this settlement stood as a bastion of resistance and determination amid the dense Vietnamese jungle. It was conceived as an advanced base for special forces, providing a strategic launching point for conducting covert missions and tactical operations in areas controlled by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army. Its strategic location allowed U.S. troops to project power in the region and conduct raids behind enemy lines. The construction and maintenance of FOB 4 represented a significant logistical and operational challenge for U.S. forces. Situated in a hostile and inaccessible environment, it required the construction of basic infrastructure such as airstrips, shelters, and warehouses to ensure effective functioning. In addition to serving as a launching pad for tactical operations, it also fulfilled command and control functions, coordinating the activities of units deployed in the area and serving as a center for communications and strategy. Its ability to maintain connectivity between deployed forces on the ground was crucial for the success of maneuvers in the region. This site was also the temporary home for hundreds of U.S. soldiers who lived and worked in difficult and dangerous conditions. The base was constantly threatened by enemy attacks, requiring extreme vigilance and reinforced security measures to protect its personnel and equipment. Let's hear the testimony of a soldier speaking about the armament they had at their disposal.
light anti-tank weapons. They'd never been used before against tanks. This was the first time in the history of the weapon that they were ever used. So we thought we were okay for a couple of tanks.
One of the main functions of FOB-4 was to serve as a launching platform for covert missions and tactical operations in enemy territory. These special forces conducted sabotage tasks and captured high-value targets. VSOG units carried out aerial and ground reconnaissance missions in areas controlled by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army. These activities provided them with crucial information about enemy troops and their movements, allowing for the planning and execution of actions with greater precision and effectiveness. In addition to covert operations, FOB-4 also played a crucial role in gathering and analyzing intelligence. Counterintelligence and reconnaissance units deployed at the base collected data on enemy activities. They also analyzed movement and behavioral patterns, providing real-time reports to operational forces in the field to design tactics and strategies aimed at dismantling Charlie, as Americans referred to their Asian opponents. Utilizing information gathered by intelligence units, U.S. forces planned and executed capture and elimination operations against enemy targets. In addition to its operational and intelligence functions, as mentioned earlier, FOB-4 also provided logistical and communication support to all forces deployed in the area. The base served as a distribution center for supplies and equipment, ensuring that units in the field had the necessary resources to carry out their missions effectively and safely. Testimonials from veterans who served in this stronghold highlight the importance of this location in the success of operations in the Eastern Territory. Soldiers praise the dedication and professionalism of their comrades in arms, who significantly contributed to the safety and well-being of the young men giving their lives for the cause supported by their country. However, the infallibility of this place and its specialized soldiers would face a night of nightmare.
The ground began to shake. When the next trip flare went off, they were under attack.
August 23, 1968, was a dark and humid night in the Vietnamese jungle as Viet Cong troops prepared to launch their surprise attack on Forward Operating Base 4. The moon barely managed to filter through the thick foliage of the trees, while the sound of jungle nightlife filled the air with an ominous buzz. It was the sound of war and death. Seizing the darkness to stealthily advance towards the American defenses, Charlie moved cautiously, prepared to kill. The Eastern guerrilla had been observing FOB-4 for days, gathering information on patrols and movements of American forces. They knew the time to strike was at night. Darkness provided them with perfect cover to launch their surprise assault against the base. Meanwhile, the American troops available on site were on high alert. They had received intelligence reports about the presence of the Viet Cong in the area and believed they were prepared to repel any enemy attack. Soldiers remained at their posts, weapons ready for combat, nerves generating maximum tension. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the violent sound of gunfire and explosions in the distance. The attack began with an intense barrage of mortars and rockets. Explosions illuminated the night and sowed chaos among the American and South Vietnamese soldiers defending the base. The Viet Cong had launched their assault, leveraging their knowledge of the jungle to advance swiftly towards FOB-4 and open fire on American defenses. The battle that ensued was fierce and chaotic. Violence reigned in the air, and the clamor of bullet casings bouncing on the ground echoed like death knells. Trained troops fought bravely to repel the enemy assault, firing from their fortified positions and hurling grenades at the Viet Cong ranks. The noise of explosions resonated in the jungle as bursts of shrapnel illuminated the darkness. It was a grotesque spectacle. Let's hear the testimony of one of the survivors. Despite the ferocity of the enemy attack, U.S. forces held their ground. They demonstrated time and again their bravery and determination, resisting the Viet Cong's attempts to take control of Phob 4 against all odds. It's worth noting that those holding the fortress were the best trained and most prepared troops in the American Army in the territory. Had they been less experienced soldiers, the enemy incursion would likely have been much more effective and swift. The battle raged on for hours, with both sides suffering significant losses in the process. Although the Viet Cong managed to inflict casualties on U.S. forces, they couldn't break through their defenses and were forced to retreat under heavy fire from the resistance's weapons. The consequences of the ambush were felt across the front lines. U.S. forces redoubled their efforts to protect Phob 4 and strengthen their defenses against future enemy attacks. At the same time, the Viet Cong suffered considerable losses in men and resources, undermining their ability to carry out such offensive operations in the region. It was clear that, despite being a bloody confrontation, both sides suffered the horrors of war equally. For this reason, the ambush at Phob 4 ended up being a decisive event in the Vietnam War. While the Viet Cong didn't manage to capture the base, the attack demonstrated the determination and combat capability of enemy forces. Furthermore, it served as a grim reminder of the dangers faced by U.S. troops in the Vietnamese jungle and the need to maintain constant vigilance at all times. This incursion greatly affected the morale of U.S. troops. The war already had little popular support, with most Americans considering it a mistake to participate in a conflict that didn't directly affect their country's interests. They saw it as a political conflict, and many watched their young sons, brothers, or partners go to die for something that didn't quite make sense. This ambush symbolized that idea to some extent. Being in the middle of the Vietnamese jungle, relentlessly besieged by enemy bullets due to an unfounded decision by the president, was more than soldiers could bear. But that wasn't the only event that would deeply mark this story. A few months earlier, the Tet Offensive would be set in motion. It was dawn on January 31, 1968. An expectant silence hung over South Vietnam. Suddenly, the roar of explosions and the thunder of machine guns shattered the stillness. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces, in a coordinated and audacious invasion, had launched a simultaneous attack on over 100 American cities and military outposts. It was the beginning of the siege. Tet, or the Vietnamese New Year, was supposed to be a time of peace and ceasefire. U.S. and South Vietnamese soldiers, confident in the military superiority of their side, were getting ready to celebrate. However, the enemy had other plans. Taking advantage of the festivities, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army attacked fiercely, catching the Allied forces by surprise. The battle for Hue, the ancient imperial city, became one of the bloodiest episodes of the Tet Offensive. For weeks, Vietnamese forces entrenched themselves in the city, waging a fierce house-to-house resistance. U.S. Marines, sent to regain control, faced a fierce struggle where every alley became a battlefield. The Tet Offensive, though ultimately quelled by Allied forces, had a profound impact on the war. Images of destruction and American casualties, broadcasted on television worldwide, sparked strong anti-war sentiment in the American public that also led to the ambush at FOB 4 months later. Confidence in victory, which had until then been unquestionable, began to erode. President Lyndon B. Johnson, pressured by the public and aware of the growing human and economic cost of the war, announced he would not seek re-election. The Tet Offensive had shown that victory would not be easy or quick, and that the American people were not willing to endure an endless conflict.
What I see when I look at that photo today are 7, 18, 19, 20-year-old kids, badly wounded. It's painful to look at.
The repercussions of this event extended beyond the battlefield. The Vietnam War became a symbol of imperial arrogance and the futility of foreign military intervention. The anti-war movement gained strength worldwide, inspiring new generations to fight for peace and justice. Despite its military outcome, this milestone marked a symbolic victory for the Viet Cong and North Vietnam. It demonstrated their organization and resilience and exposed the weaknesses of the U.S. strategy. From that moment on, the war began to tilt in favor of communist forces, ultimately culminating in the fall of Saigon in 1975. The Viet Cong's incursion came at a high cost. 32 of their soldiers died in battle. On the side of the MACV-SOG Special Forces, 17 of their men lost their lives, the highest single-day casualty toll in American military history. This demonstrates that even the most prepared troops cannot always prevail against the ferocity of battle and an army willing to do anything to fight for a cause, defending their land. Falling into the sinister clutches of the enemy army as an American soldier was the worst fate during the Vietnam War. For nearly a decade, over 7,000 American soldiers experienced tumultuous captivity at the hands of enemy forces. Immersed in the dark depths of the Vietnamese jungle, each day became a bleak ordeal from morning till night for the prisoners. They spent their time behind bars, listening to the torments endured by their comrades. A situation that repeated day after day, night after night. The ultimate goal of the Viet Cong was to gather information about their enemy's military strategy. But there were also some sinister communist soldiers who did it for amusement. In today's video, we will explore in detail each of the torture methods employed by the Eastern militias, as well as some harrowing life stories of American soldiers. Get ready for a tumultuous journey to the Vietnamese jungle of the 60s in today's installment of Military History.
You got your squad play into the left.
In the depths of North Vietnam, captured American soldiers were not considered prisoners of war. The enemy saw them more as invaders in the midst of a supposedly undeclared war. The brutality unleashed upon them was justified with this label, in a distorted narrative that overshadowed the rights and humanity of the prisoners. With this cruel conception of the adversary, 65 prisoners of war endured captivity, characterized by executions, torture, wounds, or infectious diseases. Brutality was commonplace in the jungle prisons. The North Vietnamese systematically subjected American prisoners to bloody torture in order to extract confessions of war crimes or involve them in propaganda setups. Physical punishments knew no bounds, and their purpose ranged from obtaining military information to psychological manipulation. In this grim scenario, the prisoners resisted as far as their bodies allowed, but the punishments had the power to break captives beyond the limits of human endurance. Some tortured individuals discovered that any response, even if false or deceptive, could end their unbearable suffering, or at least temporarily. The emotional burden of yielding to such demands was heavy, but many sacrificed their military oaths, preserving their lives amidst a storm of cruelty. This brought drastic post-war consequences for the soldiers, many of whom suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. This psychological disorder led many to exhibit violent behaviors upon returning to their civilian lives, reaching tragic extremes where fighters could not bear the weight of their memories and took their own lives. Part of this mental disorder was due to the North Vietnamese cruelty experienced in repeated sessions of physical punishment. There were different prisons along the length and breadth of the eastern coast where the conflict unfolded, but one stood out as the largest and held the most prisoners. We are talking about the Hanoi prison, ironically called by American soldiers Hanoi Hilton, in a bitter reference to the chain of luxury hotels in their homeland. Far from massages, spa service, and continental breakfast, prisoners lived crowded, receiving beatings daily and going without food for several days. In these sinister locations, various tactics of corporal punishment were employed, each more horrifying than the last. The Viet Cong had a series of favorite punishments, all equally violent and barbaric. Let's start by describing one of the most well-known, known as the rope trick. American soldiers who suffered this ordeal still dream to this day of the ruthless use of a meat hook suspended from the ceiling. This dark symbol terrified soldiers in the torture chamber, challenging them with its presence. In the cruel torture sessions with the hook, the Vietnamese tied the hands and feet of the captive, sometimes joining them behind and sometimes in front. The ropes, pulled taut to the limit, choked the tortured person, sometimes causing fainting. Bent over or doubled over, the prisoner was raised towards the hook as the guards pulled the ropes and left them suspended in the air. This procedure deformed the soldiers' bodies to the point of dislocating some limbs, usually the shoulders. Not even the most capable contortionist could endure this procedure. Let's take a look at some material that illustrates this.
We know exactly what that torture looked like thanks to drawings by Mike McGrath.
But they put your arms behind your back and they'll cinch up your elbows until your ribs start pulling apart here. Then they rotate over your head until your shoulders dislocate. And no man can stand the pain.
The sessions of this savage practice lasted for hours, even days. Guards returned at intervals to check the vital signs of the tortured. As time passed, the militias tightened the ropes until the prisoner lost sensation in their limbs. The clock ticked, and the limbs turned purple, sometimes swelling to twice their normal size. Another type of torture, more traditional and less macabre, was also inflicted by the Vietnamese military with particular spite. Extreme beatings were commonplace, leading to the death of many brave prisoners who endured more than their war-worn bodies could bear. Stoically, Many American soldiers died maintaining silence, denying valuable information to their captors. The United States Military Code of Conduct has a clear and simple directive. Prisoners of war should only confess to the enemy their name, rank, serial number, and date of birth. Many soldiers were broken by the mistreatment and abuse of the Viet Cong, but others resisted heroically. For what the Communist Command of Vietnam wanted to know were the details of missions, objectives, and tactics employed by the Americans. Reluctance came at a high cost, and each revelation was measured cautiously, safeguarding closely held secrets that could alter the course of the battle with blood and pain. In this fluctuation between the obligation to speak and loyalty to the mission, the Code of Conduct became a talisman for many American soldiers, finding in their oath the reasons to withstand the suffered tortures. Another way to break soldiers was to subject them to psychological and propagandistic punishments. In the dark dungeons of the Vietnamese jungles, communist indoctrination was part of the punishments. Guards subjected prisoners to endless broadcasts of Radio Hanoi and interminable ideological lectures that resonated during torturous sessions of physical punishment. When they weren't applying penalties to the soldiers, the Vietnamese watched how the nature of the neglect in which they were made to live wore down their health. Medical negligence lurked like a specter threatening the captives. Unsanitary conditions caused rodents and insects to bite and sting prisoners. Vermin attacks unleashed infectious diseases that weakened or directly killed their victims. On the other hand, the diet to which the Americans were subjected seemed more like a cruel mockery than sustenance. The food consisted of an insufficient mixture of light pumpkin or cabbage soup, accompanied by pieces of bread and rice, and occasionally decomposing or raw meat. Prisoners faced the cold with frozen food in winter and scorching hot dishes in blazing summers. This happened because the guards enjoyed watching their prey suffer while eating. Obviously, the lack of resources such as warm clothing, hygiene, and antibiotics caused captive soldiers to endure cold, live among their own excrement, and suffer various infections. When Viet Cong members wanted to put on a spectacle with their torture methods, they used some more flashy ones. One of the most feared and common was known as the submarine. This cruel form of torment mainly consisted of subjecting the captive to a dark, violent ritual, where water became a lethal instrument over a cloth inexorably covering the victim's face and airways. There were various ways to carry out the process. In one variation, the prisoner lay on his back, immobilized with precise inclination. The cloth, functioning as a sinister veil, settled over the prisoner's face. With calculated precision, the torturers poured liquid over the airways, triggering a nauseous reflex and plunging the captive into a terrifying drowning experience. In some cases, the victim was directly submerged in a water pit and forced to float for their life. Water was used as an intermittent weapon that avoided immediate death, causing nothing but suffering. However, the risk persisted, as a continuous flow could seal the prisoner's fate with relentless suffocation. The submarine not only infused acute pain, but also left abhorrent sequelae. Damaged lungs, brain injuries from oxygen deprivation, and bone fractures from struggling with the guards were the physical consequences, and a terror of water remained permanently in the unconscious of the tortured. Returning to the intention of spectacularizing torture, there was a milestone during the Vietnam War that demonstrated the treatment American soldiers received. The scene of the Hanoi March in July 1966 painted one of the most blatant and sinister exploitations of prisoners of war. Bound in pairs, 52 American captives were forced to traverse the streets of Hanoi with bowed heads, fueling the public fury of North Vietnam. The cruelty of the scene was immortalized in footage filmed by the North Vietnamese, a visual narrative intended to show humiliated enemies at the mercy of enraged communists. Let's take a look at some images of the event. Everything was going flawlessly in the macabre parade to showcase the power of the Viet Cong, until what began as a humiliating march turned into chaos when the prisoners were attacked and beaten in the midst of an angry mob. Authority lost control over the crowd, and both American soldiers and guards found themselves embroiled in a desperate struggle to find some safe avenue of escape. Most prisoners of war were severely injured, turning the march into a disastrous episode at the communication level for North Vietnam. The propaganda film, instead of portraying a spectacle of strength and leadership, revealed a violent mayhem that led to the attack on defenseless captives. The circulation of the material generated the opposite of what the Viet Cong sought, as the international community vehemently condemned what happened, creating a barbaric reputation for the Vietnamese inhabitants. Living conditions and tortures were so overwhelming that very few prisoners even considered the idea of planning an escape. However, some brave prisoners of war dared to defy the odds. Navy Lieutenant George Coker and Air Force Captain George McKnight plotted a freedom attempt from the bowels of the Dirty Bird prison in Hanoi, navigating 25 kilometers downstream before being recaptured. Without mercy, both were chained for days and transferred to Alcatraz, another tiny prison specially designed to isolate those whom the North Vietnamese wanted to isolate and bury in oblivion. Another escape attempt was in May 1969, when Air Force Captains John Dramisi and Edwin Atterbury plotted a meticulous escape from the claustrophobic Zoo Annex prison. Although their plan was ingenious, they barely managed to travel a few kilometers. The cunning with which the Americans orchestrated their escape unleashed the fury of the penitentiary authorities in North Vietnam. The summer of 1969 became a dark chapter of inhumanity during the Southeast Asian War. For 2 weeks, the prisoners of the escape committee who had helped Dramisi and Atterbury suffered brutal tortures to reveal all the details. Even those who knew nothing of the plan were subjected to torment. Already scarce food rations were reduced, and many prisoners suffered savage beatings in the following months. Let's hear from a former prisoner talking about the experience.
These are leg irons, and if you misbehaved according to their rules, they'd lock your ankles in here.
How long would they leave you in those things?
I was in it for, I think, maybe 2 or 3 weeks or so.
2 or 3 weeks?
Right, yeah.
The torture tactics of the Vietnamese guards reached unimaginable extremes. A prisoner was hung upside down from the ceiling and electrocuted with a car battery. Torture teams, armed with rubber belts, tore the naked skin of the prisoners. Others were beaten and forced to kneel for hours, enduring relentless lashes. For 2 weeks, Navy Lieutenant Commander Red McDaniel endured more than 700 lashes. With open wounds and electric shocks, while subjected to physical and psychological torture. When they rested from physical punishments, prisoners were forced to sleep amidst their own and animals' excrement, causing infections and wounds, as well as other types of diseases. Many Americans watched as the farm animals in the camps where they were captive lived better than them. In the escape attempt, the North Vietnamese brutally beat Atterbury to death, while Dramisi endured 38 consecutive days of beatings with fan belts. Sleep was denied to him during this period, forced to remain seated on a small stool all the time. He was savagely beaten, tied with tight ropes or shackled while being forced to write and record apologies. With only 2 small pieces of bread and 2 glasses of water a day, Dramisi lived a hell on earth. Although he survived, he would never forget that he was forced to witness the death of his companion Atterbury, and as part of the torments the Vietnamese rehearsed. In the aforementioned Alcatraz, torture of the most rebellious prisoners transcended the physical. Prisoners were confined to small, dark, poorly ventilated cells similar to dungeons, kept in shackles for more than 15 hours a day. Navy Lieutenant Harry Jenkins faced 85 days chained for trying to communicate with another fellow prisoner. Air Force Colonel Robbie Reisner endured 10 months in solitary confinement, trapped in absolute darkness, while Lieutenant Colonel Swede Larson faced a similar situation for 18 agonizing months. This regime of isolation, far from being unique in Alcatraz, was a shared punishment in many camps. For many prisoners of war, the years slipped slowly into the abyss of isolation. Captain Tom Moe, after a brutal torture session, considered death as an escape from pain. Beaten for hours, bent backward with ropes and irons, suspended from a pole and almost drowned with a dirty cloth, he longed for the release of death. His captors, cruel in their ruthless mission, sneered at him. "Dying is easy. That's why we'll show you how hard it is to live." Amidst the torture and lost jungle prisons, there was a man who stood out above the rest of the American prisoners for the hatred he aroused in the enemy. In the vast jungles of 1966 Vietnam, where colossal heat filtered through the density of foliage, the story of the intrepid soldier Dieter Dengler emerged as a rarity amidst the conflict. Dieter, a U.S. Navy pilot, found his destiny in the Vietnam War when his plane was shot down over enemy territory. His abrupt fall marked the beginning of an epic odyssey, a struggle for survival that would arouse as much fascination as resentments. Captured by North Vietnamese forces, Dieter faced an uncertain fate. Unwilling to accept his fortune, he barely had a chance. He embarked on a desperate escape through the intricate Vietnamese jungles. In this first escape, he managed to remain free for a short time until he was recaptured. During this new captivity, he suffered the most inhumane tortures as a result of the anger caused by his escape. In addition to all the punishments mentioned above, bamboo splinters were buried under his nails, and using the same plant, cuts were made in his skin and bits buried to infect the wound. This caused unbearable pain that the soldier endured with admirable determination. Finally, after months of anguish, Dieter was rescued in a spectacular episode. He managed to escape from a camp by stealing a machine gun and killing those who were watching him. After wandering through the jungle, he wrote the distress signal "So zones with rocks" until he was spotted by an American plane. This story, worthy of a movie, made it to the big screen with the film Rescue Dawn, starring Christian Bale, which recreated the tumultuous adventure of this prisoner of war in the Vietnamese jungle. Let's take a look at one of the final images. During the Vietnam War, thousands of Americans were captured and turned into prisoners. According to data from the United States Department of Defense, around 7,000 Americans were prisoners of war during the conflict. From this figure, the vast majority were released at the end of the war in 1973, when the Paris Peace Accords led to the repatriation of these mistreated soldiers. Regarding specific figures of survivors and deceased among those who suffered the tortures of the Viet Cong, the number of survivors is unknown. However, some prisoners died while in captivity due to the brutal punishments to which they were subjected. The exact numbers may vary, but all numbers are said to be devastating. Not being lesser, it is not considered insignificant, as the horrifying tortures they were subjected to will be forever written in blood in the history of 20th century military conflicts. In this way, we are reaching the end of today's chilling video. We thank you for staying until the end, and we look forward to seeing you in the upcoming installments of Military History.